Okay, welcome to the lecture for Chapter 8 on crime and criminal justice. All the notes that I'm going to be putting on the board are already on Brightspace as lecture notes, right? So I already uploaded the lecture notes for this chapter, and I'll be adding to that with what I'm saying during lecture, but anything on the board, if you miss it or if it's kind of hard to read or whatever. I know this isn't this is kind of a rough setup, but I'm filming it on my phone, so if you miss anything on the board, obviously you can stop and rewind, but if you still can't make it out, it's all in the notes that I already posted on Brightspace. Okay, so the chapter's broken down. I'll talk about it sort of as it's broken down. The first part, we're going to be talking about crime. What is it? I'll be focusing on public concern about crime and how it is that we or the authorities measure crimes that are happening. Section 8.2, that's types of crime. I'm not going to spend too much time on that section because I feel like types of crime, it's not very sociological. It's more for like a criminal justice class or something. So I'll leave that to them. And we will kind of just focus on the sociological stuff. But I do want to talk, there's a couple of things I want to say about different types of crime, and I definitely want to talk about white-collar crime since that doesn't get discussed enough. Just make sure this is adjusted well. Okay, so because that doesn't get discussed enough. And then Section 8.3, who commits crime, we'll talk about all the different sociodemographic variables that go into who commits crime. Section 8.4, explaining crime. That's going to take a while, right? There's a lot of different theories through functionalism, functionalism and symbolic interactionism primarily, and then conflict theory to try to explain crime. None of which really explains white-collar crime, but we'll explain property crime and street crime and things like that with those theories. Section 8.5, the criminal justice system. I'll spend a little while talking about that. I'll talk about policing. I'll talk about the court system a little bit, inequality in these things, and I'll definitely talk about our prison system. And then finally, Section 8.6, I'll talk a little bit about different ways that we can reduce crime that are alternatives to our kind of extreme, tough on crime, lock everybody up kind of policies. Sorry, let me just prop this up a little. Yeah, that's better. Okay, sorry, there's going to be a lot of adjustments and stuff as I try to get everything in frame. Okay, so let's start with Section 8.1. So crime is a kind of what sociologists refer to as deviance, and deviance is just a violation of social norms, right? So crime is a specific kind of deviance in that crime is a violation of what's called formal norms, right? In other words, i.e., crime is a violation of our laws, which, we all know that. It's obvious. Now, public concern about crime, how we think of crime, how most people in our society think of crime, is, I would argue, somewhat disproportionate to the reality, right? So when surveyed, so public concern, or you could say perception, is disproportionate. So when surveyed, at least 2/3 of people who are surveyed, say in the GSS or whatever survey we're talking about, 2/3 of people say that they believe crime is on the rise, right? And we do these surveys every so often, and over again, the people who are polled say that they believe crime is increasing rather than getting better or leveling off or whatever, right? Now, in reality, that is not the case. In reality, with the measures that I'll talk about in a minute, we see that crime has decreased overall. Right now, there are different measures, like you can talk about all different types of crime, and you can measure those individually, and sometimes some types are on the rise and sometimes they're dropping off, right? And so there are definitely peaks and valleys over the years for different levels of crime, but overall, very broadly speaking, very generally speaking, crime has decreased since around the early to mid-90s, right? And it's kind of plateaued. So our crime rates, right, are better than they were a few decades ago. But again, when you try to figure out what the public perception is, the public perception is not that crime has gotten better. The public perception is that the situation is constantly getting worse, right? So there's a skewed or a disproportionate public perception when it comes to crime. Now, why is that the case? Well, one major culprit as far as the public perception of crime is likely the media, right? The media sensationalizes crime, right? So the media focuses on certain stories, and so they essentially reinforce the skewed public perception of the threat of crime. I think like 25% of crime stories in the media, let's just say 25% of crime stories involve homicide. Why? Because that's, the most horrific, most sensational crime. People will read about it, people will watch the story, whatever, right? But, homicide, murder really accounts for less than 1% of crimes committed, right? So it's not happening all the time everywhere. But when you see these stories over and over, right, maybe if you're on your phone looking at news stories, you might see the same story through multiple newscasts, or you might see a couple different stories about homicides, right? Every time you look at the news, that gives you, and it's not irrational to sort of form these opinions because of this stuff. It's so ubiquitous that it kind of gives us the impression, right, that this stuff is happening a lot more frequently, or is a greater threat to ourselves or a danger to ourselves than it actually is, right? So it kind of helps create this skewed perception of crime. And historically speaking, too, the media has focused on crimes, by minorities against white people and all kinds of awful things that have created other kinds of skewed public perceptions, like racism and fear of minorities and minorities being involved in crime and all that kind of stuff that we also want to avoid. The media is at least partly to blame for some of that. Okay, let's talk about how we can talk about facts, right? Because remember, a social problem, and crime obviously is a social problem, has the two facets. It's got the subjective component, which we kind of talked about when we talked about the perception, right? How society sees the social problem, whether they see it as a social problem, etc., right? So that subjective side, we definitely as a society see crime as a social problem, and we're very afraid of it, and we actually kind of blow it out of proportion a little bit. But there's also the objective side. So how do we get to the actual negative consequences? So how do we measure crime itself to try to get at the objective side of the social problem? And there are really two ways that we measure crime, or at least two places that we get most of our crime statistics. The first is the Uniform Crime Report. Right? I shorten it to UCR a lot. the Uniform Crime Report. This comes from all crimes reported to the police, right? And this report is compiled, this data, right, is compiled by the FBI. Right? So the Uniform Crime Report gets at all reported crime. Now, so there are a bunch of problems with relying entirely on this data. And the biggest problem is that it's estimated that only about half of crimes get reported to police, right? So there's a lot of people not reporting crimes, right? Maybe they're not reporting because of fear, they don't want to be, labeled a snitch, or they're not reporting because it's a fairly petty crime, right? Or and various other reasons. So like a lot of crime goes unreported. So that's the first problem with relying completely on the UCR. The other problem is that there's different ways that the reported data gets skewed, right? So one of the problems with this is that it's kind of up to police discretion whether they take down a report when they respond to a situation. It depends on the situation and stuff. I don't know all that much about it, right? But at least to some extent, it's at the discretion of the different officers whether they make a report or not. So in some cases, you lose some reporting that way. There have also been scandals in which, like city governments and mayors and things wanted to have lower crime rates, and so actively told departments, let's stop reporting A, B, and C to lower our crime rates and stuff. So that's obviously not legal, but tampering with different kinds of reporting. And other kinds of trends can affect reporting too. Obviously, reported crimes skyrocketed when we came up with the 911 call system, right? So that, obviously that's decades and decades old now, but before that, there was less crime reported because there was less, it was more difficult to report crime to begin with. So there's all sorts of ways in that different trends or different actions by individuals can affect reporting. And so it's not the best report to rely on, right, as far as crime stats. But it has its benefits. The other main place we get statistical data on crimes is from the National Crime Victimization Survey, right? The National Crime Victimization Survey. The whole point of this is to get at crimes that were not reported to the police. So what this survey is it's just a survey of a representative sample of the American public, right? Asking people, have you been the victim of a crime? What kind of crime? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So even if people didn't report it to the police, they can report it on this anonymous survey without fear of repercussions from their assailants or whatever, is involved in why people don't want to report to police. So that estimates that the crime rate is about 1.8 times higher than what we see in the UCR. Okay, so that's how we measure crime. All right, let's move on to section 8.2. For the most part, like I said, I'm just going to kind of breeze through this because I'm not interested in doing this sort of listing of all these different types of crime and why, what differentiates property crime, things like that. So again, we'll leave that up to the criminal justice instructors. But what I do want to mention with respect to violent crimes, and the book, and if you're interested in this book, has a lot of statistics on homicides and things like that. It's just a couple of things that are relevant as far as that subjective side of the social problem, that are relevant as far as the public perception. One is that there's no great threat from homicide. There aren't tons of murderers, strangers out there lurking the streets looking to murder people and stuff. So it's statistically unlikely that anyone's life will end in a homicide, right? But when you look at these kinds of violent crimes, what you find is that most people who die, from being murdered in homicides are killed by someone that they know really well, right? Usually, a spouse or family member or close friend. And in most of those cases, it's precipitated at least partly by the victim. I don't want to be a victim blamer, but what I mean is there was some kind of altercation or fight, right? And then someone ended up being murdered. So that's, first of all, that's the case, right? So when we're talking about the worst kind of crime, the most violent crimes, the vast majority are committed by people that, the victim is really close to. The other thing, and I'll just mention this briefly because I think this is another kind of old kind of fear, right, that's unfounded and racist, is that whites respond to these surveys as being afraid of minorities because of crime and violent crime and things like that. And if you look at crime, most crimes committed by white people are against white people, right? And most crimes committed by minorities are against minorities, right? So there's not a lot of interracial and ethnic crime happening. Most crime happens within groups rather than between groups. So that does something to dispel some of those kind of prejudice and myths about crime, right? There are not necessarily, there's not a threat of strangers, lurking out there to commit violent crime. Statistically speaking, that's a very, very, very low likelihood. Most crime doesn't look anything like that. All right, so that's one thing I wanted to say about, that's kind of fell into the discussion of types of crime in 8.2. The other thing I want to talk about, the type of crime I want to talk about, is white-collar crime, because when we talk about crime, again, as part of that, that public perception, that subjective part, we focus on street crime. We think about violent crime. We might think about mugging or robberies or other kinds of property crime. We don't really think about white-collar crime that much when we talk about crime. It's not the first thing that pops to mind. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on it. The definition here is crime committed, right? So crime committed by people of, I think this is the book definition, respectability, right? And what is it? High status, right? Yeah, respectability and high status in the course, right? Typically of their business dealings, or in the course, let's say, of their occupations. I think that's how I put it in the notes. So white-collar crime is when, it doesn't have to be individuals either. It could be corporations. I'll talk about corporate crime in a minute, but white-collar crime is when individuals or corporations exploit their superior resources, exploit their position, their power, their money, their access, right? They exploit these things in order to gain, right, basically an illegal profit for themselves, right? So that's white collar crime. And corporate crime is kind of, if white collar crime is an umbrella term, corporate crime is a kind of white collar crime, or a type of white collar crime, right? Now, economically, white collar crime costs billions more a year than all other property crime, street property crime combined, right? Billions more. In the year, I don't have the stats in front of me, but in the year that the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme was discovered, right? I think the property crime totaled for that entire year, all property crime, we're talking, motor vehicle theft and all that stuff, all that combined totaled like $15 billion for that year, something like that, in losses. But Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme, one guy running one scheme, basically cost I don't know, they don't even know the real numbers. It's somewhere between $20 billion and $60 billion in losses in that 1 year, right? So white collar crime costs a lot more economically than property crime at the street level. The other thing is that corporations, right? Corporate crime includes things like fraud. I won't put it up, but it includes things like fraud and price fixing and stuff. So that corporate crime is the bulk of that, the billions and billions of dollars in economic losses, false advertising, etc., etc. I also want to briefly mention a type of corporate crime called corporate violence, right? When we're talking about white collar crime, it's not all financial loss. It's not all economic. It can be, it can result in people being sick or maimed or dying, right? So corporate violence. And that's when, so I'll say actions by corporations that maim, sicken, or kill people, right? It's not funny. I don't know why I'm chuckling, but it's awful. And oftentimes the victims of corporate violence are the employees that work for the companies, right? So unsafe working conditions. You can think of like mining accidents or workers being exposed to toxic substances, et cetera, et cetera. But they also include like, the victims could be employees. The victims could be consumers, the public. So consumers or just the public in general, right? So consumers, corporations sometimes, sell unsafe products to consumers that end up hurting people or killing people or sickening people. Sometimes corporations dump toxins or chemicals into drinking water, and that sickens a lot of people or kills a lot of people, by polluting the environment where people live. So there's lots of different ways that this could happen, and oftentimes, corporations know that maybe a product is unsafe or something, but it costs, they'll lose profits or it'll cost them too much to change anything, so they just allow it to happen. I think the most famous example is probably, hopefully I'm getting the car right, it's probably the Ford Pinto, right? It was a little before my time. In the 1970s, right, they produced this car. It had some problem with, I believe it was the location of the gas tank, and if you rear-ended one of these Pintos, it was likely to explode in a fireball, right? And so it was pretty costly to change the production line and make these cars differently. So Ford basically did the math and said, no, we're not going to change anything. We'll just settle the lawsuits that come in when people burn to death, right? Yikes. But that's what happens when you have a corporation, not an individual, but a corporation that's thinking entirely in terms of profit and efficiency and not in terms of human costs. That kind of thing can happen. So that's white collar crime. Not only does it cost billions of dollars a year in losses, it also, has a steep cost in terms of lives, right, and morbidity too. All right, moving right along. We're going pretty quickly here. Section 8.3, who commits crime? And here we're talking about basically the socio-demographic breakdown, right, as far as who commits crime. So I'll talk about gender, age, social class. I'll start with gender. As far as who commits crime, when you talk about gender, it's males overwhelmingly, right? Males commit more crime than females. Males account for 81% of arrests for violent crime, right? 81%, that's high. And males also account for 63% of arrests for property crime. I don't know the stats for white collar crime, but I'm assuming males commit more of that too, right? Because it's all about access with white collar crime. Okay. Age. Basically, young people commit more crime than older people. So highest rates are, as far as arrest rates for crime, are late teens to early 20s. Remember when we talked about drugs and alcohol? That's also the peak rate for the use of illegal drugs and stuff, so that's not too surprising that it's also the peak age range for arrests for crime. 15 to 24-year-olds in particular account for 40% of arrests for all crime, right? 40%. So young people commit more crime than older people. So that's gender and age. Now, let's say socioeconomic status, which, how much money, how much wealth and income people have. Socioeconomic status. Poor people commit more street crime, meaning violent and property crime, than wealthier people. Obviously, wealthy people are more likely to commit white-collar crime because you need that access in order to be able to do that. But poor people definitely, or at least account for much more of the arrests for street and property crime. I can talk about why this is when we get to theory. Obviously, the conflict theorists are going to have something to say about this. Society's structured in such a way as to be, to the benefit, or the most benefit to the most well-off. So it's obvious, that laws are going to affect poor people more harshly, or more poor people are going to end up in prison. There's also a theory that even comes out of functionalism called strain theory that I'll talk about in a minute that helps explain this too. But basically, poverty is desperation, and desperation sometimes necessitates other ways of trying to make money. All right, so socioeconomic status, poor people commit more crime. Another variable we could look at is urban versus rural residents. Crime rates in urban areas, and this isn't probably not surprising, this is the kind of perception we have of urban areas, but crime rates in urban areas are much higher than crime rates in rural areas, right? There's a couple ideas on why this might be the case. The first is that there's concentrated poverty in urban areas, right? And like I just said, poverty means desperation, and it means maybe having to resort to criminal means to make money. So that's one reason why you have more crime in urban areas. But also, and I think this is interesting, another reason might simply be more people. Population density, right? So remember, youths commit more crime than older people. So you have a high population density, so a high concentration of youths together, right, in this like high population density. And what the high population density means is you have a lot more opportunity for young opportunistic criminals, right? So there's like a lot more cars that can be broken into. There's a lot more residences that can be broken into. There's a lot more, people walking down the street with their wallet kind of hanging out of their pocket. There's just a lot more opportunity because of the density. Also, this is just my personal take on it, but if you go to an area that has a high population density, people seem to be less personable with each other and more self-motivated. And I don't know why that is, because they're constantly having to wait in lines, and you have to kind of scrap to get what you need for yourself, because you're competing with so many other people all trying to do the same thing. Maybe that's it. But when you go to a major city, like, people are just more rude than they are in rural areas, and that's, I think, has something to do with population density, and that might be related to why there's a difference, again, in crime rates between urban and rural areas. All right, what other variables do I want to talk about? Okay, the last one is race and ethnicity, right? So this also plays a part in arrest rates, right? Now, I'm going to explain a lot of this by talking about institutional racism within the criminal justice system, and other reasons why this might be the case. But African Americans, especially African American males and Latinos, right, Latino males, are more likely to be arrested than whites. Meaning, given their ratio to the population, their arrest rate is higher than for whites, even though there are more white people in the population. So more white people overall, as far as the numbers go, might get arrested. African Americans and Latinos have a higher arrest rate. They also they're overrepresented in our prison population, and I'll get to that when I talk about the criminal justice stuff in the end. In fact, I'll explain a lot of this when I talk about criminal justice in the end. But some ways of explaining this are the fact that these minorities also live in urban areas, right? So there's higher arrest rates and higher crime in urban areas. But it's explained, right, a lot of it anyway, by institutional policies within policing, within the court system, even within prison systems, that sort of lead to unequal outcomes between different races and ethnicities. So within all levels of the criminal justice system, for Latinos and especially for African Americans, you find this institutional racism. So what I'm talking about is, kinds of like policing policies, like racial profiling, obviously, right? And racial profiling is still a problem around the country, right? But what racial profiling means is that it means African Americans, especially in urban areas, are much more likely to have to interact with police officers than whites, and that means that they're more, if they are like in possession of drugs or something like that, they're more likely to be caught doing it than whites if they're being racially profiled. Another problematic policing practice is stop and frisk. And this definitely leads to more African Americans and Latinos being arrested, because stop and frisk is not done in suburban areas so much as it's done in urban areas. So urban areas where crime, with high concentrations of minorities, where crime takes place on the streets, you can do stop and frisk, meaning cars, the cars can just pull up, put a bunch of usually young, minority males up against the wall, frisk them, take whoever has something illegal on them, and so that leads to these kind of higher numbers too. Again, these minorities live in these urban areas. They're more subject to poverty. There's lower access to opportunity for good education, meaning the schools are no good. No good. Didn't sound very educated. So there's less access to good education, and there's less access to employment opportunities where poverty is concentrated in these urban areas. So that goes to explain a lot of it too. And I'll talk about some more things when I get to the criminal justice system discussion. All right, here's where we're going to have to take some time. Section 8.4 is explaining crime, and that means theory. So I'll start with functionalism. I think there are at least a couple theories within the functionalist paradigm. I'll move on to symbolic interactionism because there's a few theories that come out of symbolic interactionism. And then I'll end with conflict theory. And remember, all this stuff is in the lecture notes on Brightspace already. All right, let's start with functionalism. And the first theory I want to do from functionalism sounds a lot like functionalism. The second one doesn't sound as much like a functionalist, but it comes from Merton, and he was a functionalist. So, okay, so the first, remember functionalism, right? As a paradigm, the idea that society is a system of interrelated parts called institutions, and they function together to maintain social stability, right? So the functionalist is obsessed with maintaining social stability, and they care a lot about institutions and how they're working, how they're functioning, the needs that they're meeting for society. So the first theory I want to talk about from functionalism, explaining crime, is called social disorganization theory, right? The idea behind this is that crime results from institutional breakdown. Right? So if you go back to like when sociologists were first talking about crime in the US, like the early 20th century, and the Chicago School of Sociology and stuff like that, they were looking at urban crime, and they said, it looks like we have this problem of crime in places with institutional breakdown, in places where the institutions within the society are not functioning properly, right? So crime results from institutional breakdown basically means that crime is a symptom of the dreaded social instability, right? The instability that the functionalist is worried about. Institutional breakdown, societal instability. And so the institutions that weren't functioning properly in these areas that they were talking about in, say, the 1920s or whatever, early 20th century when they're talking about this, the institutions were things like the educational system wasn't functioning properly, local governments were corrupt, even police, were corrupt, or there weren't enough of them, so that institution wasn't functioning properly. There might not have been enough employment. There might have been economic problems, obviously economic problems. There was poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So when those institutions are not meeting the needs of society, you have social instability, and that manifests itself in crime. Right? Basically what happens is having weak institutions weakens the social bonds of people within society, and they're more likely to commit crime. Now, I think it was the Chicago School that found that it really is more about the social disorganization and about the institutions than it is about, say, like we were just talking about, like race and ethnicity. They looked at one particular neighborhood. I can't remember what this was called, but this study looked at one particular neighborhood, and they found that no matter what immigrant group came through, it would be like one immigrant group would come through and live in this neighborhood, and then as they made more money and things, they would move out to other neighborhoods that were better, right? They found that no matter what group of people lived in this neighborhood, it had the same problems of crime because the neighborhood itself had all this institutional breakdown that they could point to. So that's another sort of validation for this theory. All right, the other theory I want to talk about comes from a functionalist named Robert Merton and is called strain theory. And this is the idea that when people lack access to socially acceptable means, to socially acceptable goals, they are more likely to innovate. And innovate here is a nice way of saying use criminal means, right? Resort to criminal means. All right, so let me explain that. The idea that when people lack access to socially acceptable means, to socially acceptable goals, they are more likely to innovate or employ criminal means to get their socially acceptable goals. All right, so what we're talking about when we say socially acceptable means. So what are some socially acceptable means to achieving our goals in society? Well, maybe I should start out with the socially acceptable goals. One socially acceptable, the primary socially acceptable, meaning that everyone says, yeah, this is okay, this is what we should be striving for as individuals in our society. The one socially acceptable goal that we all agree on is, achieving financial security or success. In other words, one of the socially acceptable goals we agree on is money, right? It's perfectly normal and encouraged to pursue money in our society, right? So that's a socially acceptable goal, to try to make money. Now, socially acceptable means to those goals, I'm going to erase that because it's hard to read, but socially acceptable means to that socially acceptable goal of money include things like education and employment, right? You get educated, you apply yourself, you get a good job, and that's how you're supposed to make your money in society. So what Merton is saying with strain theory is that there's a tension here, or a strain, right? When people don't have the same amount of access to socially acceptable means, right? Because not everyone has the same kind of access to good schools, getting a good education, right? Affording college as others, right? Some people start off in a much better position. And not everyone has the same access to employment even, right? In urban areas where poverty is concentrated, there's fewer employment opportunities. In rural areas where there's just less going on, there's fewer employment opportunities, right? So not everyone has access to the same socially acceptable means. So what this theory says is when people lack access to those socially acceptable means of things like education and employment, they are more likely to use criminal means to make their money, right? Pretty straightforward. And it makes sense of why you see higher crime rates in areas with poverty, right? Okay, so there are three theories I want to talk about that we can kind of put under the symbolic interactionist paradigm. Okay, symbolic interactionism. Remember, Functionalism is macro level. Symbolic interactionism, we're talking about the micro level. We're talking about individual individual interactions or individuals interacting with one another, right? So the first theory the book talks about is differential, with respect to symbolic interactionism, is differential association theory. I think it's sometimes referred to as learning theory. And that's because young people, especially, young people learn that crime is acceptable, right? And as well as how to commit crime from those close to them, right? Now, this is not explaining crime at the macro level, right? Things like poverty and desperation might, in strain theory, might explain crime in general, where crime comes from at the macro level. This is explaining how crime kind of works at the micro level, meaning how an individual comes to commit crime. And this theory says you have to learn it from somewhere, right? Even if it's hot wiring cars, no one's born knowing how to do that. You have to learn how to do that. No one, is born knowing how. I guess now we have the internet and you can look things up, so maybe it's a little different. But typically there's some sort of interaction with people close to the person if they want, to use the internet to figure out how to do this stuff, right? So no one's born knowing how to cook meth, for instance. You have to learn that it's acceptable from the people around you, right? And for most of us it's not, and you have to learn how to do it from the people around you. So that's why it's sometimes called learning theory, differential association theory. Meaning the different people you associate with can help, predict whether you get involved in crime or not. Okay, the next is social bonding theory, sometimes called control theory. Social bonding theory, or sometimes called control theory. This basically says that social control is a function of social bonds in society. Or another way of putting that is the greater the strength of one's social bonds, the less likely one is to commit crime. Right? The more attached, right, especially like a young person, the more attached a person is to their family, to their school, to their community, right, the less likely one is to commit crime. So the strength of the bonds is sort of inversely related to the likelihood, right, of committing crime. The less people feel any bond with others or connection to society, the more likely, right, in turn, the more likely they are to commit crime. That's social bonding theory or social control theory. And we could definitely see that with delinquency, kids who do not have strong bonds with their families and schools, etc. Okay, the final one from symbolic interactionism is labeling theory. Right? And this is the idea that labels are really powerful things. Being labeled, right, criminal right? Or deviant, right? Or felon, or whatever label you attach to it, or ex-con, right? Can be a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts, meaning people get labeled as criminal, they internalize that label, and then they act accordingly, and continue to commit crime, at least in part because of that label and because of how they're treated and perceived by others, because of the label that's been attached to them, right? This is really particularly true of kids that are labeled criminal or deviant at a really young age, right? Or labeled delinquent, right? Because we put kids into the juvenile system at pretty young ages, and we're telling kids, right, at a very young and impressionable age, you're a criminal, right? So it's not surprising that they internalize this and hang out with other kids who've also in these juvenile delinquent systems, right? They hang out with other kids in these juvenile detention centers and stuff that have also been labeled deviant, and then everybody, these kids start to act accordingly, and then they're far more likely to end up in the adult prison system when they get older because they've internalized this label. These labels can act as a master status, right? That's a term that W.E.B. Du Bois coined when talking about race. He was saying that being, for instance, a black male is a master status, meaning it's how society labels you based on your primary characteristics. So for someone who's an ex-con, right, that could be the primary characteristic that society uses to pick them out. So not only is it just a self-fulfilling prophecy if you're labeled criminal and you internalize it and you think you're criminal and you behave that way, it's also, in a much more practical sense, problematic, and that if you're labeled a convict, if that becomes your master status when you're out of prison, that label being attached to you makes it more difficult to get a job, it makes it more difficult to get housing and stuff, and you need all that so that you don't wind up back in prison. But a lot of people do. We have really high recidivism rates, and people wind up back in prison all the time, and part of that is probably because of these labels and how they function. All right, so that's the last thing I want to talk about in the symbolic interactionist paradigm. Really quickly, we'll talk about conflict theory. Basically, a lot of what I'm going to say about the criminal justice system, right, pointing out problematic aspects of the criminal justice system, is itself critical theory or conflict theory. So I'll be doing more of it. But the conflict theorists, right, they focus on inequality with respect to the outcomes, right, of the criminal justice system, right? The idea that we hear over and over again, those in society with the most power and resources have a greater say. They have a greater say in the laws. They have a greater say in who in our society gets punished and for what, right? So the people with the most power and resources have a greater say, right? People are much less likely, wealthy people are much less likely to end up in prison. They're much less likely to be convicted of white-collar crimes and things like that because they can afford even legal counsel, right? So there's a lot of inequality, but also people with a lot of power and resources have a greater say in determining even what our laws are, what our policies are, as far as like, tough on crime kind of things. And I'm going to talk about all that in a minute, right? So that's all that the conflict theorist is saying. And we can kind of see this in some past examples. One of the examples that gets brought up a lot is the difference between, like, this was corrected, I think, a few years ago under the Fair Sentencing Act, or something like that. I think Obama, it might have even been a presidential order, but it was under the Obama administration, I think, and it changed this problem. But for decades, the laws regarding crack, for instance, were different from the laws regarding powder cocaine, right? So, like, if you got caught, I think with 10 grams of crack, you could get up to 10 years in prison, versus getting caught with 100 grams of powder cocaine, I think I'm remembering that correctly, would get you 10 years in prison, right? So there's an obvious double standard there, and it also just makes no sense because you make crack by adulterating powder cocaine. So powder cocaine is more concentrated than crack, so it wouldn't make sense to have it have lighter sentences for powder cocaine. But the idea at the time was they were worried about the crack epidemic, they were worried about gang violence, and crack was associated with poor urban minorities, and cocaine was associated with wealthier people, right? And the laws were different, and they affected people differently depending on what group you're in. So that's kind of an example of that. But again, that was corrected with the Fair Sentencing Act. But I'll talk about a lot of different ways in which corporate interests and things like that have a lot of say in, unfortunately, in our criminal justice system and how we do it, right? And so that's what I want to talk about now. Section 8.5, the criminal justice system. And really, I'm just going to talk about the social problems, right? I'm going to critique the criminal justice system. I'm going to talk about the social problems that are inherent within the criminal justice system. So we'll start with police, we'll talk about courts, and then prisons, I have a lot to say about that. So police, courts, and prisons. And a lot of this discussion I typed up into the notes on Brightspace as well. So problems with policing that we know about, right, include police corruption, police brutality, right? Some of that police brutality involves racial profiling. Another problem with respect to policing is the increased militarization of police. So ever since the war on drugs, police departments have become increasingly militarized in such a way that when they, carry out a drug bust or something, they basically use full SWAT, which is, military garb and weaponry and all that kind of thing. And you're talking about doing this to, in a residential area, in someone's home. So it's a bit strange. And then the other problem of police is the various aspects of institutional racism involved in policing. Like I already mentioned, racial profiling. I talked about stop and frisk in urban areas earlier as well. So those are also problems related to policing. And basically, overall, this kind of institutional racism means the outcome is the disproportionate targeting of minority males, especially African American and Latino males in urban areas, which accounts for what I'll talk about in a minute, which is their overrepresentation in the prison system. All right, so those are some of the problems anyway with policing. Now, as far as criminal courts, right, the biggest problem is that poor people do not do well in court because they don't get good legal counsel, right? There is a lack of adequate legal counsel for the poor, right? Most criminal defendants cannot afford good legal counsel because the majority of criminal defendants are poor, right? Or they often receive inadequate legal counsel from an overworked public defender, right? Not that the public defenders aren't working hard, but they don't get paid well. They're overworked and underpaid, right? So they're either having to rely on a public defender, and in some cases, people don't get any counsel at all, which is just unconstitutional, right? So that's problematic. And what happens is people more often than not, these poor criminal defendants, more often than not, take plea deals, right? Because they don't have good legal counsel to go to trial. If they do go to trial, they're worried about harsher sentences, right? So they take plea deals instead. And it's estimated that only a small percentage of criminal cases actually even go to trial, because most of them end in plea deals. And you can imagine someone who doesn't have good legal counsel and is worried about going to trial and getting a really harsh sentence might take a plea deal even if they believe they're innocent, right? So it's really problematic. And again, this is not a problem that affects wealthy people that end up having to deal with the criminal court system. So there's inequality with respect to socioeconomic, right, variables and racial and ethnic variables. All right, let me talk about prisons because I have a lot to say about that. The U.S. is the world's most prolific, let me get my notes, jailer, right? The U.S. has more prisoners than any other country in the world. We have about, I think, 4.4% of the world's population and over 20%, I think 21% of the world's prisoners, right? So we lock up more people than any other country. We also, and the reason for this is not only do we lock up more people, right, but we also have longer prison sentences than most other countries, right, especially most developed democratic nations, right? So because we lock a lot of people up and we have really long prison sentences, that accounts for our massive prison population, right? And our prison population has been increasing exponentially, so we've seen a 12-fold increase in the number of prisoners we have since the 1980s, right? And so a lot of that is down to policy and legislation. So if you go back to the 1980s, to like Reagan era, we start to have the war on drugs, which is a big piece of this, right? Because the war on drugs begins to lock a lot of people up for nonviolent drug offenses. So we have like a large number or ratio of people in prison and federal prisons for nonviolent drug offenses. So that's part of it. But it's a tough on crime policy, and tough on crime is not just the war on drugs. It's kind of popular across the board with politicians. Because, again, remember, the public perception of crime is that crime is getting worse. So the people, the voters, are going to vote for politicians that have tough on crime policies. So it benefits pretty much every politician since the 1980s to be tough on crime, whether you're Democrat or Republican, it doesn't really matter, right? People vote for politicians who are tough on crime, so politicians end up being tough on crime. In fact, a lot of really problematic legislation, tough on crime legislation, was passed during Clinton's administration in the 90s, right? And he was a Democrat, so it doesn't, again, it's pretty much all these politicians being tough on crime. So that kind of leads to the culture that we're in, the policy culture that we're in now, and we've been in for several decades, and that's why we have this massive, or partly why we have this massive prison population. The other reason is that there's a lot of lobbying power behind tough on crime, like supporting, advocating for tough on crime legislation. So first is the prison industry. We're building more and more prisons. We're constantly building prisons. We're also constantly privatizing prisons, so these companies can make a profit by filling prisons. And the prison industry is a big part of the economy. And they get huge contracts with the governments to fill prisons. Sometimes they get paid, even when they have empty beds. So like the point is that they want to keep prisons filled, and so they're lobbying for policies like, I keep saying tough on crime, but what I mean by that is policies like 3 strikes laws and policies like mandatory minimum sentences and things like that, right? Longer sentences. So that's the kind of things that the prison industry would be lobbying for. On top of that, to make things worse, we use prisoners as a source of cheap labor as well, right? So big corporations can utilize prisoners as a source of cheap labor. Now, you could say that this is like a way of doing vocational trainings in prison, which can be a good thing. But basically, big corporations like Starbucks and McDonald's and stuff can pay prisoners, pennies a day because they've got a roof over their head and they've got food and everything else, to do menial things that they need, labor that they need done, like, I don't know, like putting together the cardboard things for the coffee cups and stuff like that, right? And they don't have to pay them much. So if you think about the fact that, taxes go into paying to house these prisoners, even if we're contracting with private companies and stuff, and then you have corporations utilizing them for cheap labor, it's essentially subsidized labor for these corporations. So now all of a sudden you have corporations that have nothing to do with the prison industry, right? As far as their profits go, I mean, they kind of do because of the labor, but like they would otherwise have nothing to do with the prison industry. Now you have these corporations which also have a fair amount of lobbying power, with a motivation to have tough on crime policies. Like, the two things shouldn't be going together, but they are. And so that's also kind of contributing to this system that we're in, where we lock up such a large portion of our population. Another problem is what's sometimes called the school to prison pipeline. We have a lot of zero tolerance policies in our school now. We start out people in the juvenile correction system very early, right? We even sometimes put young people in adult prisons, like teenagers and things like that, depending on what they've done. And we give young people long sentences, right? We just don't have good rehabilitation services for juveniles. And, again, like the earlier you start to label them criminal and the earlier you start to treat them such and get them in the system, the more likely it is that they're going to continue in the system and end up in the system, right? So that's another piece of it, is young people. And then even another piece of it is the mentally ill, right? So in the 1950s and 60s, we developed a lot of drugs to try to treat mental illness. And then by the 1970s, we were kind of en masse closing our mental institutions, right? And mental institutions were not good places, right? So they kind of needed to be reformed or closed or something. But we closed them, and the plan was at the time to set up these sort of places where people could go to make sure, like community places, to make sure that people would get their medication, right, and keep up with their medication and things like that. The funding for that never happened, so that those things never came to fruition. These like community clinics or whatever they had in mind to try to keep people medicated, and people didn't stay medicated. So when we kicked people out of these institutions, they ended up on the streets. So a lot of our mentally ill end up homeless, and they cycle in and out of prison because they get into trouble when they're on the streets. And so that's kind of another problematic portion of our prison population. All right, finally, as I mentioned a couple times, African Americans and Latinos in particular, racial minorities, are overrepresented in the prison population. I think African Americans account for 13 to 14% of Americans, something like that, but they account for over 35% of our prisoners, right? So there's obviously unequal outcomes based on race. And I said that's because of institutional racism within policing. That's because of the fact that once you get into the criminal court system, if you don't have financial means, you're not going to get good legal counsel, and you're going to end up in prison. So there's a lot of reasons for this. But it's not good, right? We need to correct some of these unequal outcomes. And honestly, we need to stop locking up so many people in general. But at least if we're going to lock all these people up, we need to correct for the inequalities in the system, right? Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about the prison system. Finally, the last little bit, 8.6, reducing crime. we need to find some alternatives to our tough on crime approach, because we're, the land of the free, and we lock up way too many people to keep that title, right? And we have really high recidivism rates. Probation works better, has a higher efficacy rate. So like if you get on probation, you're less likely to end up in prison. But once you end up in prison, recidivism rates are really high. So you're likely to end up back in prison when you get out on parole or whatever, right? In prison, prisoners go into prison and mix with a bunch of other criminals. It's just a system that doesn't work that well. So we need other things like serious efforts to reduce poverty, unemployment, getting people greater access to educational opportunities, more probation, definitely more drug treatment programs, maybe some decriminalization of drug possession, right? So that we're not putting as many people in prison for nonviolent drug offenses, and then definitely better early intervention programs for youths, right, where we're not labeling them criminal and forcing them into something that looks like the adult correction system at such a young age, right? Because we don't want them to get used to that and consider that a normal life for themselves, right? And at the same time, going back to what I was talking about earlier, we need to focus more attention on white-collar crime as well, and combating corporate crime and corporate violence. All right, that's it. That's the lecture on crime and criminal justice. I will see you during the next group chat. Thanks for showing up at the first group chat. It's a good way for me to take attendance, and it's a good way for me to communicate with you. So I'll see you then.